Kunsthalle to the lecture by Marc-Alexandre Dumoulin. Marc-Alexandre Dumoulin is a researcher at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and a practicing artist, and I'm very thankful, Marc-Alexandre, that you are here with us today. One could say, I think it's not exaggerating to say that you are obsessed by Corita Kent's artistic practice, as am I, of course. But the interesting thing is that I would say we approach her work from a different angle. So I conceive of this event as a complementary angle and view on Corita's practice. Whereas to me it was very important while curating this show to highlight also in, for example, selecting the documentation and archival material, to highlight the parallel that Corita Kent saw in two movements which happened in the 1960s. On the one hand, the renewal of the church brought about by the Second Vatican Council, and on the other hand, the pop art movement, who, as you all know, tried to merge elite and popular culture. And I think it's very fascinating how she tried to intertwine and make them the one, put the one in the service of the other. So, for example, to take the artistic knowledge of how to merge elite and popular from the pop art, and bring it in the question, how can we revitalize the church in the 20th century? How can there be a connection between the very old ideas of the church and the everyday life of the 20th century? At the same time, she took the spiritual hope and strength that the religious life allowed her to live, and brought this to the political struggles that her work dealt with, so social justice, and namely the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Marc-Alexandre will focus on the process of creativity in Corita's work herself and also in her teachings. So how did she want to transmit what it means to be to produce art, to be an artist? And I think it's a very interesting angle. Your lecture has a title, Ecstatic Creativity, Corita Kent's Intertwining of Spiritual and Artistic Practice. Now, welcome very warmly with me, Marc-Alexandre Dumoulin.
Hi everybody. I'm also very happy to be here. I'm very thankful because, as Nina said, I'm quite passionate about Sister Mary Corita, and it's quite an honor to be here because it's the first retrospective of her work in the German-speaking world, and so that's quite the honor. I remember the first time we spoke also on the phone. I think we had to talk for 25-30 minutes just about the work, and sort of we were so enthusiastic about the work that we first had to sort of get it out of our system before we could start to get serious with what this discussion and this lecture should be about. As Nina said it, I'm not going to focus so much on the close reading of the work. I also don't really want to go into the biographical elements. I will, of course, we'll talk about the work and we'll talk about the biography, but since we have such a nice survey here, I felt like it would be redundant to talk about this. So what I would like to talk about is the process of art making and how central it is to Corita's understanding of art making in itself, the experience of art making, but also how she always wanted to communicate that experience in her teaching practice. So the way she teaches is a bit unconventional. She's not quite teaching canon, she's not quite teaching this sort of aesthetic canon. She's more trying to communicate an experience in the practice of art. So I would like actually to open up this discussion by talking about my own first encounter with Corita, which sort of sets the tone of our discussion. I did not see her work for the first time. The first time I encountered her was actually by hearing her talk. I was in my studio, and when I'm in my studio I listen often to podcasts or to music, because I need this sort of room. I need to be 80% concentrated on the work, on the artwork, maybe 20% sort of distracted. So basically I'm listening to music or to discussions, radio, whatever. And so I'm painting, and I've put this podcast on, which features music along with snippets from documentary film on Corita. But of course I don't know her, so I'm just painting and I keep on hearing this woman talking. And every time I'm listening to her, I'm always thinking, wow, I can really relate to this. She's talking about creativity, she's talking about the experience of making. Yeah? And the way she talks about it is not so much about canon, about art history, about concepts. She's talking about how one feels when one engages with the creative process. And to me, it felt I was painting and I was listening to this, and it rang so true, you know? And one of the things that stuck with me in that podcast and in that discussion of this stranger that I didn't yet know was a portmanteau expression that she had built for herself. So she had put two words together. She had put play and work together. And she had made a word of it, plork. And plork, she says, is the one responsible act necessary for human advancement and represents the ecstasy we feel when work and play are one and the same. The thing with plork is that you don't even need to be an artist to know what plork is. I mean, sometimes I do the dishes and I know what plork is, because when I do the dishes, I'm sort of in this meditative state, and I'm playing and I'm working. I'm working, but at the same time my mind wanders, right? But of course, plork in the art is very present, right? You just grab a piece of paper, you just start drawing for a while, and at one point you start, your mind starts wandering, and you get that meditative state. And actually just me listening to her in that studio, talking about plork was an example of me actually plorking, engaging in this process of play and work. Corita was talking, and it gave me this sort of space to enter into this meditation and sort of, improvise or be open for new things. And so after about half an hour of this weird, somehow a bit uncanny situation where I'm in the studio listening to a woman talking to me about what I'm currently doing in that studio at that very moment, I just turned around and I went to look, who was it? And so that's how I got to know Sister Corita Kent. I didn't know her work before. I first heard her speak. So for me, this whole teaching aspect of her work is very important. And then fast forward about 4 to 5 years later, I'm giving a seminar at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna about the concept of artistic essence. And I included her, and I actually called the seminar "Consider Everything an Experiment," which is a quote from her. And what I wanted to see is if the students could relate to this. I wanted to talk about her work, but I also wanted to talk about how she talks about art. And I wanted to see if the students, this new generation of students, saw what I saw in her work. And every student was completely smitten by her, very inspired. And so for me, it was quite a nice experience. So, Corita was an extremely dedicated artist, and she was also a very gifted orator. And as you see, she was also a very charismatic figure. She really, somehow through the screen, through the speakers, there's an aura about her. But the thing is that her years of teaching and her years of artistic practice are a bit difficult to disentangle. The sort of peak of her career is really those 10 years where she's at the community college, and she's teaching and she's making art. I mean, we could debate about this, but that's how I see it. And so when you want to look at the work of Corita, if you want to look at Corita the artist, you also have to look at Corita the teacher. But then if you look at Corita the teacher, you also need Corita the artist to understand both. And then there's a sort of a third vector, which is basically the point of this lecture here, is that Corita is not just a teacher and an artist, but she's also a spiritual person. She's a nun. And when you look at this, when you think about the fact that she's a nun, and you look at the way she's teaching art, you see that actually she's not quite teaching art, rather than preaching it. Because rather than talking about, once again, about sort of external structures or rules, what she shows you is this experience that one has when one makes art, and how that experience can transform you, can change you for the better. And so when she gives a course, rather than imposing something, she wants you to sort of discover that experience for yourself and to experience it yourself. So it's almost more about spreading the gospel than about any sort of academic structure. Although, of course, there's a lot of structure in her exercises and her teaching. That's not the point. But the experience is really the focus. And then, of course, if you look at, for example, this silk screen, as Nina said, there's this blend of pop, and there's this sort of spiritual message, a very religious message. So here, for example, see the man who can save you the most is both Jesus and your Chevrolet dealer, so the person who's selling you a car, right? So she takes this slogan and then she makes it into something spiritual. And I think that's also something that's very interesting, because nowadays I feel if you think about, I think curators and artists are a bit uncomfortable with this idea of spirituality and sort of the combination between spirituality and the arts. And so I think when you think about spirituality and you think about the arts, you'll think about some hippie, sort of new agey aesthetic, or you might think about the canon, right? All these nativity scenes, all these religious scenes throughout art history. But then Corita is this very contemporary, very modern artist, but nevertheless that spirituality is there. And so I think she's a very interesting sort of juncture point to think about the experience of art that's linked to spirituality. And yeah. Okay. So, as Nina said, the lecture is called Ecstatic Creativity. And I thought this would be a very nice term to sort of sum up the teaching practice and the artistic practice with her religious practice. And why I chose this title is because here's her definition of creativity as she lays it out in her last book, Learning by Heart. This energy, which we call making, is the relating of parts which make a new whole. The result might be a painting, a symphony, a building. If the job is done well, the work of art gives us an experience of wholeness called ecstasy, a moment of rising above our feelings of separatedness, competition, divisiveness, to a state of exalted delight in which normal understanding is felt to be surpassed. So here there's the Webster, because she quotes her source for defining ecstasy. She took that definition from the Webster. As you might recall, her definition of plork, of play and work, also has the word ecstasy in it. The one responsible act necessary for human advancement that represents the ecstasy you feel when work and play are one and the same. So already I feel there's quite a lot to unpack here. First of all, she tells us that art is not just art, right? So basically, she says a painting, but it could also be a symphony, could be a building. And this work of art, it transforms us. It gives us a moment of rising above our feelings of alienation, literally, and gives us an intensified experience of life. And so art, looking at art and making art, puts her in a state of ecstatic state. And then if we look at plork, we see that actually the making of art is play and work, and that's in that moment. When play and work are the same, that's when we experience ecstasy. So art to Corita leads to ecstasy. So I'd like to go just a bit closer, because I feel this is still, a bit too general. So I would like to go to the root definition of ecstasy. So ecstasy comes from ancient Greek, ekstasis. And it means being outside the self, or rapture. And actually, in Greek, in ancient Greek, you can actually use ecstasy as a verb. And then it would mean that you're literally stepping outside of yourself. You stand outside of yourself. So basically, ecstasy is about going outside of yourself. But how do you do that, right? And here, of course, if we think about Corita, then we have basically a whole tradition within the church. We have Christian mystics, right? We have, for example, this is here, Bernini, the sculpture is Saint Teresa of Avila. She was ecstatic. On the left, that's Catherine of Siena by Giovanni di Paolo, and she was also ecstatic. And then we have Angela of Foligno, who was also ecstatic, and we have Saint John of the Cross, which is, for example, quoted downstairs in the silk screen, who wrote extensively about ecstasy and was himself ecstatic. And so, and basically, this state of ecstasy is not limited to the Catholic Church. Basically, ecstasy is something that each culture experiences differently. The ecstatic state will change according to the culture and how it's formed, but all of these ecstatic states, regardless of the culture in which you find yourself, are attained via specific exercises. So for example, these are the dervish worlds, the Sufi dervish worlds, and this state of ecstasy is in the meditation of spinning constantly and the sort of hypnotic quality of the outfit, right? But for example, there's countless studies of shamanic practices where breathing exercises or ingestion of hallucinogenic substances lead to ecstasy. So basically, ecstasy is something that either happens to you by accident or willfully, but according to all culture, it exists, and it's attained via specific techniques if you want to. So here I have two quotes, one from St. John of the Cross and one from Catherine of Siena. And here's a quote from Corita. And I want to do just a bit of a comparison. So that's from the stanzas of an ecstasy experience in high contemplation by St. John of the Cross. I entered into unknowing, yet when I saw myself there, without knowing where I was, I understood great things. I shall not say what I felt, for I remained in unknowing, transcending all knowledge. I was so whelmed, so absorbed and withdrawn, that my senses were left deprived of all their sensing, and my spirit was given an understanding while not understanding, transcending all knowledge. And in Catherine of Siena, that's just a short excerpt, for the eye sees without seeing, the ears hears without hearing, and the tongue speaks without speaking. So ecstasy is not something only that you can attain via exercises, or that can happen to you, but this movement of going outside of yourself is something that, for example, these mystics describe as going beyond your normal sort of sensory reception. You don't see, hear, feel the world the same. You feel it different. And that experience cannot be translated in words, so it goes beyond the discursive. It goes beyond discourse. And therefore, for example, St. John of the Cross needs to say an understanding while not understanding, because there's no way to see it. If we look at Corita, this is an exercise in looking. So that's a study. That's what she does in order to sort of get inspiration. There's an exercise I've learned lately, and that is to be quiet and look at an object or space directly ahead of you. Keep a soft focus and also allow your attention to reach past your peripheral vision, left and right. In addition, place your attention on top or above your head. And all of these directions, front, right, left, above, being looked at with a kind of diffuseness. You try to have a clear moment when you are empty and open to things around you. You see them new. Your vision is cleansed and you can make contact with what is really there, uncluttered by old thoughts and prejudices. Always be ready to see what you haven't seen before. It's a kind of looking where you don't know what you're looking for. So I don't know if you guys see the similarity here, but this sort of idea of willing to go at the edge of what you can see, of what you can experience. And then to sort of welcome that new, that unknowing, that X factor, that X quantity, as we will see later. And at the same time, also this exercise of study is not like you would say, like a classical artist who goes with his sketch pad and just looks at the landscape and draws. It's about the experience. This sort of it sounds like meditation, literally. If you think about this sort of peripheral vision, this experience. So Corita tries to meditate into a sort of a state of creativity, of art. So what I'm trying to say here is that Corita was employing creativity as a way to go beyond her normal perception of the world, beyond her normal, her constructed, let's put it like this, her constructed understanding of the world. And in doing these meditative exercises, she was going step by step towards this. But these, of course, this sort of exercise of looking is complemented with an artistic practice and with a life in the studio. And so you could say that her meditative practice, her ecstatic creativity, would be triggered or would begin once she would step foot in the studio and she would start the process of creating. So now I've been talking about the doing. I would like to talk now about the art, like the artwork in itself, what it means, the artwork for Corita. And then I will talk about the studio. This is her studio, by the way. So to Corita, art does not really begin inside a museum. It begins inside the studio. Art is about the making of art. As I said, it's about the experience of making something. And that something you're making, it does not even necessarily need to be art, as we've seen. What it needs to be is an object or a support upon which, you invest all your energy, all your attention, all your dedication, and that this object gives you nothing in return except for the experience of it, the sort of enjoyment of the making, and the aesthetic experience of it. Basically, the visuality that comes at the end. So basically, to Corita, art is not so much about the art object in the end. It's about the process leading you there, the journey. And I think it tells also, you can see it in the medium that she chooses, which is silkscreen. Silkscreen is done in series, and the idea of this sort of the masterpiece is pretty much, has pretty much evaporated. It's a democratic medium. And therefore, it emphasizes the process rather than the end art object. Yeah, above her classroom, she had a pretty telling banner that was hung above the classroom to remind all the students. And of course, this is also her own approach to art making. So above her classroom, it was written, "We have no art, we do everything as well as we can." So to Corita, art is not inside a museum, it's not in a specific space. Of course, it can be in a museum, and it can be in a gallery or a Kunstverein. And actually, she also exhibited in galleries and museums. But it doesn't have to be. It's not exclusive to it, right? Art is everywhere, and it's not about this final result, but rather about the experience. And the final result is just the sort of springboard to the next artwork. It's the springboard to the next artwork. That's how you get to the next one. Here's an excursion that she did, and I think that brings my point across pretty clear. Here's an excursion she did with her classroom. They went to the Watts Tower. Those are the Watts Tower. This is a monument of outsider art found in Los Angeles. This was built by a mason, a Maurer, I think we say in German, and his name was Simon Rodia. And he worked from 1921 until 1954. This man put all his free time in building these towers. There's 17 of them. It's a sprawling complex of these useless towers. And so this guy was spending all this time and all this energy and all this love for the sheer pleasure of doing so, and for the sheer aesthetic experience that it gave him in the end. And so you can see here that this sort of excursion is also to get her point across, right? You have these students who are all walking with their own self-made sign, and then it looks almost like a procession or a demonstration, and they pass this amazing monument to uselessness, this amazing monument to uselessness. So just at the risk of repeating myself, it's in the journey of making something with all the love and all the commitment that you can, and knowing that this thing serves no purpose, that you get into that creative experience, that you're one step closer to that creative bliss or that creative ecstasy, because you freed yourself from the constraints of like the socially constructed. Okay. Where am I? I mean, I would like to just meditate a bit on that. If you think about it, so if you put all this energy, all this time into one work, you still need to set yourself certain rules. You still need to set yourself, for example, you have to choose the support, you have to choose the medium, you have to choose the sort of aesthetic rules which you want to follow. And then you set out to dedicate all your time and energy towards that one thing. But at the same time, you're completely free, because those rules are all arbitrary. If you'd be building a house, on the other hand, you would have to follow certain rules, otherwise the house would collapse. And basically, that's what she wants to show to the students, this free experience of labor, in which you can actualize yourself, you can project your own desire and set your own rules, what you want, and then go and reach it. Okay. This is from, again, from that same book, Learning by Heart, which I have here. This is a brilliant book. It cost, I think, 10 euros. She made it very accessible, and I would all urge you to buy it because it's wonderful. I always love this image. I think it says 1,000 words. So you see, she writes next to it. She writes basically, "This is Plork said differently, right? Watch a child when she is drawing a painting. You will see a worried look on her face, a look of intense concentration. Is she working or playing?" Basically, what she wants to say is that she's in this state of Plork. Right? So I would like to just look at it and just think for a second, like put ourselves in the shoes of this young girl. So she's completed this drawing. I don't know if you can see with the projection. So there's this little monster, and then there's this bunch of tulips on which she's really absorbed. So let's say she's got a little table with like markers and different brushes, and she's extremely absorbed. She's in this state of Plork, so she's very, very concentrated. She's finished her outline, and then she's like, she wants to start drawing the tulips. And she reaches out for that color, right? And she doesn't know, because she's so much sort of absorbed with the drawing, and she reaches out for the black marker. And then she starts painting the flowers with a black marker. And she's sort of surprised, because it's not a usual color for a flower, right? But then she might look at this, and then she thinks, huh, a black flower, interesting. And from nothing, from a small step, from a small accident, from a small happy accident, all of a sudden, she went beyond that socially constructed. She's discovered something new, something she didn't expect before. And so she's sort of stepped beyond this culturally constructed, this socially constructed being that she is. And here again, we have sort of a similar movement to this notion of ecstasy, as we've seen, for example, with the Christian mystics. And then, of course, the other thing is that she's completely absorbed, and she's forgotten herself for a minute, right? And she's following her guts, she's following her desires, but she nevertheless has these rules, or this sort of structure that pushes this endeavor forward. And I think we could also sort of almost give a certain shape to that space of stepping outside of ecstatic. I would sort of situate this space between form and formlessness, between difference and similarities. So when you're sort of in between these things, you're in a space that is full of potential, where everything seems like is recognizable, but is not what it seems. And that's where you sort of grab onto these new discoveries. Okay. Now I would like to show you a little excerpt of Corita going to the studio. Okay. So this is a film, and we will see her get into her studio. And I would like to just look a bit at what the studio space means in that context of going beyond what you know, of sort of loss of control and creative ecstasy. So as you see, so now she's leaving the supermarket and she's going around the corner to the studio. And I would like you to think about how many times she went inside that studio throughout her life. How many times she opens this door and then smells the ink, smells the solvent, smells the paper, smells the emotions. And how many times she did that ritual. You'll see she comes around and then she starts preparing her habit and putting on her apron to get ready for the work. And look at her gaze. It's like it's already completely out there. It's not anymore in the task at hand right now. It's already thinking. She's already thinking about what she will be doing next. She might be thinking about a silk screen that she feels satisfied. She might be thinking about a silk screen that needs improvement. But she's not there doing this. She's already in this sort of meditative state. It's a bit like when you know when you lock your door and then you go out the building, and as soon as you're out of the building, you're already asking yourself if you actually locked the door. Your mind is already out of the building because you're so used to doing that gesture. And here, it's a similar idea. She comes in, her mind is already in the creative task at hand. She's already sort of halfway in that meditative state. She's ready to produce. And then the other aspect. So already here we have a sort of what I would call a trigger for this ecstatic state, this meditative state. But then on top of that, she's working with silkscreen, which is divided in many sort of small tasks, menial tasks. So for example, cleaning the screen, or then using the screen and squeegeeing the ink through the screen. So all that creative process that she does, all these fonts and these images, they're always cut in between with moments of labor, of work. And so she'll be creative, as you see, for example, here. She's going to get really absorbed in the painting, in the creative process. She'll be painting on the screen. But then after that, she'll start just silk-screening, which is this very mechanical, very meditative process. And so, to Corita, this plork is always in this sort of interaction between manual labor and creative labor. And each time there's a session of manual labor or sort of repetitive labor, comes after that a moment of creativity, because all of a sudden she sees the work and she can make that extra step into the unknown, to go beyond what she could have thought of when she first set foot in the studio. I want to say something else about this, but I think I forgot. Okay. Of course, this is a bit of a staged film. I think people behave a bit differently if you have a camera pointed at you than if you're just alone in the studio. This is my studio sweater. I included it because all my studio sweaters look the same, and that's for a good reason. This here, the left sleeve is always where I remove the excess paint before I start painting again. And this here, that's the wiper sort of motion I do when I'm in that state of creative ecstasy. Basically, I smell the paint, I step in the studio, I get that look that Corita gets, and then I start painting, and at first I'm sort of, and after a while I get so absorbed that this tick emerges, and I just frantically am rubbing this paintbrush while looking like this in order to look at the painting differently. And I don't notice this, right? I'm gone. And often it goes to a point where the last 20 minutes of the studio time, I'm not close to the painting, and I'm doing this, and I'm painting, and I forget to look at what I'm doing. And for me, that's creative ecstasy. If I forget to look at what I'm painting, that means I'm out there. I'm beyond myself. I'm outside of myself. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is also that if you go beyond what you can see, right? If you go to a sort of a place where you forget time, where you forget to see, where you forget yourself, then you go to a place where you're sort of beyond judging. You just accept and you embrace. Things come to you, and since you're not quite looking and you're completely sort of hypnotized, you just accept. You embrace and you move with it, right? It's like somebody's throwing at you a curveball and then you go with it. And I think that's where we could talk about Corita's practice, and especially her teaching practice, as transformative. Sorry, I just have to again find my place, where I'm at. Yeah, so basically if you're beyond judging, what does it mean? It means that you're ready also to adapt. So anything that's been thrown at you, any new sort of factor, any new ideas that come to you, you'll just take it and you'll accept. And so in her teaching practice, I think this is also what she wants to show. She wants to show the students that in this creative experience comes also a sort of exercise in adaptation. It sort of trains your muscle of adaptation, of adapting to what comes towards you, and welcoming it, rather than sort of pushing it away, and then embracing these new ideas, or this unforeseen, this unknown. So basically the ecstatic is to go beyond yourself and reach out into that other. And I mean, I think I don't need to say that this also applies obviously beyond the studio, right? It sort of applies on a social level. And this is also why Corita spoke to me so deeply, because I feel we're also a bit in a time right now where there's a sort of a general ambience of fear of the other. And Corita's message is the complete opposite to that. Now I would like to shift from the studio and the art practice to the classroom. So yeah, Corita was a teacher. She was, I think, a wonderful teacher, and but she was also extremely demanding. Corita exercises were like, do 100 drawings, or take that viewfinder, look at a landscape and deconstruct it in 6 drawings, look at these 6 drawings and then deconstruct them again. She would always give this over sort of flow of artistic exercises, of creative exercises. So for example, this is a quote from one of our students. Usually assignments are very large because we do a lot of things. We do 50 things or 100 things, depending on what it is. Because you start out making those 100 things, and the first 20 that you make are based on ideas that you had. And suddenly you have to go somewhere else and start looking for, you start struggling around some kind of unknown ideas area. And that struggle will end up the best. If you start at 40, then you'll do 20 things that you thought of and 20 things that you're not sure of. And you wouldn't go nowhere after that. But then if you do 25 more, that grows out of the concept of not knowing and knowing what to do. Those are usually the best thing. So I mean, picture this for a second. Yeah? Say I have one drawing to make. Then I'll dedicate all my time and energy to it, right, as Corita says. But I'll be judging, that's for sure. Because I'll be looking at this line, and I'll be like, oh, that's not quite the line. And then I'll say, oh, this element is too much. And I'll be just always sort of going in what I think is right or wrong. What is good or bad. If you have 100 drawings to do, you do the first 20, then you're like, okay, that was something. After 40, you're like, oh, and at 60, I can assure you, you're going to be completely out of ideas. And you'll just be like, how am I supposed to do 40 more? And so you'll be sort of grasping at ideas, trying to get something going. And once again, we have this movement of going beyond, right? And that's the idea here. The idea is not about the quality, it's about quantity. And that quantity leads you to that experience. If you have to do 100 drawings, I can assure you, you're going to be in a state of plort at one point or another, or at many times. Yes, okay, the 10 rules. So, yeah. So with Corita, art is about the experience, it's about the journey. And when she teaches it, it's also about this. So the 10 rules. The 10 rules are, I think, amazing. I have them in my studio. I think they're a good reminder for both professional artists and beginners. These rules were also available in the classroom. And to me, I read them a bit as a sort of expanding upon that first sentence, which hangs above the doorway, which is, we have no art, we do everything as best as we can. If you read these rules, they are about that idea, but they just expand upon it so that the student can understand what she means by we have no art, we do everything as best as we can. To sum it up, I think the 10 rules are a user's guide to get into the creative experience. And as you can see, these rules are not like the 10 commandments. They're not dogmatic. So it's not like you do it like this or you're out. As you can see, the last sentence here is there should be new rules next week, which speaks of this capacity or this necessity to adapt, right? There should be new rules next week. That means that next week, the conditions, the social conditions, the educational conditions, the religious conditions, whatever conditions, might be fundamentally different than this week, and therefore, there should be new rules. And then the second thing that I think you can quite easily observe is that a lot of the rules repeat themselves. So for example, if I start with rule number 1, find a place to trust, and then try trusting it for a while. So what she tells you is basically, make a space where you feel comfortable, so that you can actually become ecstatic. You can lose control, you can be outside of yourself, and still feel like, I'm comfortable here. If you look at rule number 2 and 3, they're basically saying the same thing, but more specifically to the context of the classroom. Ask everything of your student, ask everything of your teacher. And so basically, the first 3 rules are about establishing a safe environment to become ecstatic. Then of course, in this sort of typical Corita humor, I will jump now to rule number 7, the only rule is work. I mean, obviously it's not the only rule because there's 9 other rules, but it's the only rule because without work, nothing happens. And of course, now that I talked extensively about Plork, I mean, you get the point with the rule number 7, the only rule is work, because when you work, you get in that meditative space, and then you can grab onto things. She says it's the people who do all the work, all the time, who eventually catch on to things. But then of course, to just work is not enough, because you could also apply yourself as, I don't know, making a house or something. And then you wouldn't have that freedom of experience, of experiencing or experimenting. So you have rule number 4, consider everything an experiment. Then you have, nothing is a mistake, there's no win and no fail, there's only make. And you have, don't create and analyze at the same time. They're different processes. So what she's trying to say, again, is it's in the experience of work, but it's in the experience of work freed from the constraints of duty or necessity that you get to that point, to that creative bliss. I think another thing that we can take from these 10 rules is that what she's trying to say is that you don't know. It's okay that you don't know, and sometimes it's actually really good not to know what you're doing. And I would like to finish my little discussion on the rules with rule number 10, which to me is sort of a message, a sort of general idea of the entire enterprise that is Corita's practice and Corita's teaching. And so the rule's not even written by her, it's written by John Cage. And it says, we're breaking all of the rules, even our own rules. And how do we do that? By leaving plenty of room for X quantities. So, if you're ecstatic, if you're beside yourself, or if you're not saying right, or you've lost track of time, you've forgotten yourself while in the labor of art making, I bet you're gonna transgress rules. You're gonna break rules because you're not attentive. And actually, if you think about it, there are no rules in art. All the rules that are there, they're there to be transgressed. And it's in transgressing these rules and going beyond what is constructed that we reach into this something else, but also in accepting or expecting that we will break those rules. We also make that space for that unforeseen, for that X quantity. So basically, in breaking the rules, in expecting that we're going to break the rules, we make space for something else, for something foreign, something unknown. Yeah. So what we could say is that through this ecstatic creativity, through this sort of feel good, because I mean, it's obvious that how she talks about it, it's quite a good feeling to be ecstatic. She says it removes the sense of alienation and it makes you feel fulfilled. Through that ecstatic creativity, there's a sort of dynamic of positive reinforcement. The students go in a classroom, they have this safe space, they go beyond themselves, they get in that ecstatic space, and in doing so, they're training their sort of muscle of adaptation, of accepting the unforeseen, the X quantities, the unknown factor. And so it's a sort of positive reinforcement between the two. And I think that in there lies the other sort of crucial idea of Corita's political engagement. Because I mean, if you've seen the exhibition, you can see that Corita was a deeply political person. And she was interested in the civil rights movement, for example. And in teaching in that manner, in forcing these students, or inciting these students to get in that state of loss of control and accepting the unforeseen, she's also training them to be better individuals. She trains them to welcome change and not sort of stubbornly fear the other or the different or the new. And so, behind that sort of political message that we see, where she's directly talking of, for example, Martin Luther King, there's also this sort of profound ethical dimension to the teaching that ties in with the political. I would like to leave you with these, with a few thoughts. This is an exhibition that she curated with her students. That exhibition is called Survival with Style. And I think that's pretty much one of the best sentences I've heard. Survival with style. Mm-hmm. And I had to think about it when I was preparing this lecture. And I had to think that our entire planet, our entire sort of world experience is modeled by survival. You know, the theory of evolution tells us that basically every animal, every plant, ourselves, look, smell, talk, move the way we do because of this imperative to survive, right? But the thing is that, for example, if you look at a tiger, you know, and you compare us to a tiger, we don't run that fast, we don't jump that far, we don't have sharp claws, we don't have sharp teeth. We do hear well and smell well and see well, but not that well. And we don't have any fur to protect ourselves from the cold. So we've survived all this time without any of these sort of normal natural attributes that all the other animals have. And then I have to think about the idea that actually humanity has survived so far because it has survived in style. It has survived by engaging in that sort of experience which Corita is talking about. And in creating symbols, creating ideas around which, you know, we can rally and we can organize and we can move on and move forward. So basically, survival with style is this capacity of producing culture and sort of, how do you say that? Commune, congregate around that culture, and then decide together to adapt to those new conditions. And I have to think also, I was looking at this silkscreen, and I had to think about that magical friend she's talking about. She's quoting Pintor, which is also a friend of hers, but who's that magical friend here? Is it Jesus? Is it God? Is it art? Is it both? Is it this sort of creative ecstasy? And then I have to think again about the survival with style. I have to think that survival with style is to embrace the new, the unforeseen, as I said, and to revise our behaviors accordingly. But overall, I think survival with style is about saying a loud and resounding yes to life in all the X quantities it might throw at you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this meditation before we say goodbye to our Instagram watchers, I would like you to react, and then we open the public discussion here. I would like you to react to one question, because you mentioned the creative, you deeply investigated the creative energy which is set free in this process of making art. And you also mentioned the ethical dimension. So would you say, because from what you said, I would extend it a bit and say this, there is a political, this might be a political tool of an anti-ideological moment. So, because she also talks about turning the common in the uncommon, or as from art as an intensified thing. Yeah. So it's always like unlearning, as you said, also the motto of the last documenta. So it's somehow also what we are trying to do in the art context at the moment, to unlearn all the ideologies and to redirect maybe. So how would you say that this translates also in the work? Like, how would you say, because you now talked about the productionist perspective, what is with the person who sees her work?
I think on a formal level, there's two things that always, I think I could also talk for hours about it. There's two things that I find very interesting. The first one is the deconstruction of language in Corita's work. You see letters, you see slogans shift meaning and sort of fall apart and sort of being reborn almost. A lot of this is about spirituality, but in the end it's sort of breaking down of language. It's sort of I always see it a bit as an aesthetic experience of going beyond these barriers, beyond this sort of preconception. Because if you look at, for example, see the man who can save you the most, and you think about Jesus, but then you also recognize it from this advertisement, then all of a sudden there's this sort of clash of these worlds, and there's this sort of erasure of the boundaries between categories, or what is socially supposed to belong here and there. And then the second thing that I find absolutely fascinating with her work is what I personally call Corita's community. So Corita always has these quotes. You have for example here, that's Joseph Pintolo. But if you start looking at all the prints, you have an insane, this woman was an encyclopedia of theology, philosophy, aesthetics, art, and she's always quoting these different people, and she's sort of creating this community of thinkers that all sort of think in the same direction, but from different cultural contexts. So she'll put, for example, Martin Luther King down there. There's a silk screen where you have a quote from Martin Luther King and from his wife, because he was assassinated. And then down there you have Alan Watts, which was a theologian, and it's one of the first to study Oriental religion. And all of a sudden, the quote of Martin Luther King is echoed by somebody who's talking about Asian beliefs, right? And so with Corita, it's always this sort of global scope, and it transcends these barriers, these sort of cultural and social barriers.
So it's also something that is really visible and experienceable through the work. So it does not, the creative process might be the beginning of it, but then there's also this learning of seeing uncommonly, or unlearning is also shared with the person who looks then at the work.
I mean, if you think about it, if you really if you decide you're going to read each text or each silk screen, you're going to be here for like, I don't know, 4 hours maybe.
But our visitors come at different times. I can always come back. This is always the idea of the exhibition.
That they can come back.
Yeah.
Exactly. But if you read them, then you start seeing this sort of how large the scope of Corita's sort of interest, beliefs, and what she wants to say, how large it is, and how complex and rich it is. But for doing this, you have to read it. And I think that's a good idea that in the booklet you did transcriptions because that makes it easier. So, yeah.
Okay, so now maybe we turn on the light. Goodbye, Instagram. We are now between us, and we are turning off all the cameras now because I want you that you feel like, because normally we have two kinds of discussions, the one here and then the second one at the bar, which is more informal. And this part, as you all know, will not happen today. So that's why we make a compromise, no cameras, you are free, we are between.